The war was over, but for thousands of German soldiers, it did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like silence. They stood in open fields, hands raised, as American guards ushered them behind hastily strung barbed wire. Dust clung to their boots. The sound of trucks idled in the distance. For men who had lived through the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles, this sudden quiet was heavier than any bombardment. The camps were improvised. Fields outside small towns were fenced in with wire and watchtowers. Rows of tents, or sometimes no shelter at all. German prisoners sat in clusters, still in uniform, their insignias torn away or hidden in pockets. Some stared at the ground. Others muttered prayers. They did not know what to expect. Rumors ran like sparks through the crowd, whispered fears of starvation, reprisals, even executions. After years of Nazi propaganda, many believed capture by Americans would mean cruelty. Yet the first surprise was order, not violence. Guards gave clear instructions, collected weapons, and issued rations. It was not generous, but it was enough. A prisoner later wrote in his diary, "I thought they would beat us. Instead, they gave us bread." For soldiers hardened by the Eastern Front, where surrender often meant death, this was a shock. Here, the enemy treated them as men, not prey. Still, the fences were real. The wire cut into the earth, sharp against the spring wind. Prisoners pressed close together for warmth, using coats as makeshift blankets. At night, floodlights swept across the camp. Boots crunched on gravel as American guards patrolled. The silence broke only with the cough of men too weak to hide their sickness, or the low murmur of prayers whispered in German. 2 weeks after capture, something even stranger happened. A convoy of trucks bearing the emblem of the Red Cross arrived at a camp near Remagen. The prisoners craned their necks to see. Boxes were unloaded, the smell of something rich and bitter drifting through the wire. Coffee. Not ersatz grain brew, not acorn powder, but real coffee. German soldiers, who had once marched across Europe in conquest, now watched in disbelief as American aid workers poured steaming cups and handed them through the fence. One prisoner later recalled, "We expected punishment. Instead, we were given coffee, hot and strong. I had forgotten the taste." The guards looked on without comment. Some POWs wept quietly, ashamed of their tears. Others drank slowly, savoring each sip as though it were the first drop of humanity they had tasted in years. The shock rippled through the camp. Men who had lost brothers in Normandy or the Ardennes now sat cross-legged in the dirt, clutching tin cups of American coffee. For many, it was more disorienting than combat. How could an enemy so ruthless in battle show such small kindness here? It unsettled them more than gunfire ever had. But behind the relief was uncertainty. The war had ended, but their fates had not. Each prisoner wondered how long the fences would hold them, whether their families had survived the bombings, whether they would ever return to the ruins of their homes. The barbed wire glittered in the morning sun, a reminder that freedom was still out of reach. As one diary entry recorded simply, the coffee was warm, the wire was still. And in the camps of a defeated army, that bitter truth lingered with every swallow. The war had ended, but the land still looked wounded. Bombed-out houses stood like broken teeth. Roads were cratered and lined with refugees carrying bundles on their backs. In the middle of this ruin, a different kind of convoy appeared. Painted trucks marked with the unmistakable Red Cross. Their engines rumbled steadily, not for soldiers at the front, but for prisoners now penned behind wire. Inside the camps, thousands of German soldiers pressed against the fences. They had grown thin on army rations that were stretched too far. Dust coated their uniforms, and many had gone barefoot. The sound of those trucks drew them forward, but none dared believe it meant good news. In their minds, convoys brought more war, ammunition, guards, punishment. Then the smell reached them. Not smoke or fuel, but coffee, strong, dark, and unmistakably real. Men who had lived on ersatz powder and weak substitutes for years felt their throats tighten. Cigarettes followed, cartons unloaded in stacks, and packages wrapped with paper bearing the Red Cross emblem. Eyewitnesses recalled how prisoners stood in silence at first, unable to speak, until the shock gave way to murmurs of disbelief. A sergeant in the camp later wrote, "We were starving, yet suddenly the Americans gave us coffee. Real coffee. I drank and could hardly believe this was not a trick." For men raised in Hitler's Germany, where the enemy was painted as barbaric, this moment was unsettling. Kindness felt more disarming than gunfire. The convoys brought more than food. They carried letters. Some had crossed oceans, written months before in villages and cities far from the front. Prisoners clutched envelopes as though they were gold, reading and rereading the words until the paper tore. "I am alive," one soldier whispered, holding a note from his wife. So is she. In a camp full of silence, the sound of men reading aloud filled the air like a forgotten language. Not everyone trusted it. Some POWs feared the supplies were part of psychological warfare, meant to soften them before interrogation. Others remembered comrades who had vanished on the Eastern Front, where surrender often meant execution. To drink American coffee seemed almost dangerous, as if accepting it would betray the dead. Yet hunger and exhaustion overcame suspicion. One by one, the prisoners lined up, cups in hand. According to American records, the Red Cross insisted on delivering aid even when Allied officers questioned the need. "They are prisoners, yes," one report stated, "but still men, and men must eat." For the guards, handing out coffee was routine. For the prisoners, it was unforgettable. The act carved a crack in the wall of hatred, letting in something human. As dusk settled, smoke from Red Cross stoves drifted above the camp. Prisoners huddled in small groups, sipping slowly, as though stretching time itself. Some sang low, half-remembered folk songs from home. The floodlights clicked on, washing the wire in harsh light, but beyond it, for a moment, the camp felt almost ordinary. Still, the fences stood. The watchtowers remained. And as the last truck pulled away, a prisoner scratched in his diary, "They gave us coffee, cigarettes, and letters. But they did not give us freedom." The cups cooled. The men stared at the wire. And in the night air, the smell of coffee lingered like a memory they were not yet allowed to keep. The sun beat down on rows of wire and tents. Dust rose with every footstep. Behind the fences, thousands of German soldiers sat on the ground, their faces hollow from hunger and defeat. They expected scorn, maybe even revenge. Instead, one morning, American guards walked through the camp with kettles of steaming coffee, pouring it into tin cups. The air filled with a rich, bitter smell, strange and almost unreal to men who had lived for years on weak substitutes made of grain or acorns. The reaction was stunned silence. Men held their cups as if afraid the liquid might vanish. Some stared into the dark surface without drinking. Others closed their eyes after the first sip, as though the taste carried them back to kitchens and mornings long gone. For soldiers trained to see the enemy as ruthless, the kindness was as disarming as any weapon. A diary recovered later captured the disbelief. "We were the enemy. We had bombed their cities, killed their sons. Yet they gave us coffee, hot, strong, without asking anything in return." In camps across Western Germany, the same small ritual played out, repeated by thousands of hands. The war was over, yet the men inside the wire were learning that surrender did not always mean humiliation. The contrast with the Eastern Front could not have been sharper. Many of these same soldiers had heard or seen what awaited their comrades captured by the Soviets: forced marches, brutal camps, starvation. Here, in the West, survival was not only possible, but touched by gestures of dignity. Cigarettes passed through the wire. Medical staff tended to the sick. In some camps, letters arrived, each envelope a fragile bridge to families scattered by bombing raids. But not all trusted it. Some muttered that the coffee was a trick, part of a campaign to soften them before interrogation. Others thought it was propaganda staged for cameras. Still, thirst and exhaustion wore down suspicion. The cups emptied, and men lined up again when refills came. One prisoner wrote bitterly in his notes, "It was harder to drink their coffee than to fight their guns." At least against guns, I knew my place. Acts of humanity did not erase the barbed wire. Nights were still cold, and guards still paced under floodlights. Hunger still gnawed at the prisoners. Yet these small gestures created cracks in the wall of hate. Some POWs whispered that America must be a land unlike the one described by Goebbels' propaganda. Others wondered if this mercy came only because they were no longer a threat. According to eyewitnesses, guards sometimes sat and smoked with prisoners, sharing stories about farms in Iowa or families in Ohio. The conversations were brief, but they carried weight. For men who had seen only orders, marches, and death, the idea that an enemy might laugh, joke, or offer a cigarette felt almost impossible. By late summer, the routines of the camps settled. Coffee in the mornings. Cigarettes traded in the afternoons. Letters read by firelight. Yet beneath it all lay a haunting awareness. Freedom was still far away. The wire gleamed in the sun. The watchtowers did not vanish. Mercy and captivity existed side by side, a contradiction the prisoners struggled to reconcile. One diary entry ended with words that captured this tension. The coffee warms the body. The wire chills the soul. And so, in the ruins of a total war, humanity returned not as a flood, but as the faint steam rising from a cup. The war had ended months earlier, yet the men inside the wire lived in limbo. Each day began with the rattle of mess tins and the sharp bark of orders in English. But whispers soon replaced commands. Whispers about coffee, about cigarettes, about America. In the crowded tents, prisoners leaned close, their voices low, speaking of the other America, a country they had not known existed until now. For years they had been told the Allies would show no mercy, that capture meant humiliation or death. Propaganda films in the Reich had painted Americans as violent and greedy, soulless invaders bent on destroying Europe. Yet here, in the dust and heat of a prison camp, those same Americans poured steaming cups of coffee through the wire and handed out Red Cross parcels without demand or cruelty. The contradiction unsettled the prisoners more deeply than the defeat itself. One diary found after the war carried a single line: "They fight like wolves, yet feed us like neighbors." Men who had fought at Normandy, in the Ardennes, or in Italy now struggled to understand this duality. How could soldiers who rained fire from the sky also send their nurses and aid workers to ensure captives had letters from home? The question gnawed at them, reshaping their understanding of the war they thought they knew. The rumors spread quickly. Prisoners from different regions, once bound by loyalty to the Reich, began comparing notes. Some described guards who spoke kindly, others recounted small acts, an extra cigarette, a blanket slipped to a shivering man. These fragments built into a story larger than any single camp. Across Western Germany, captives were learning that the enemy was not one thing, not the monster they had been taught to hate. Yet the discovery did not bring comfort to all. For some, the coffee burned with shame. They remembered villages leveled by their own units in Poland or the Soviet Union, prisoners starved under German command, and the cruelty of Gestapo camps. To be treated with mercy when their country had shown so little was, for many, unbearable. One soldier admitted to a fellow prisoner, "It is easier to be hated, harder to be forgiven." American officials noticed the effect. Reports noted that German morale shifted not with threats, but with acts of fairness. Some officers debated whether this was deliberate strategy, softening the enemy to ease post-war occupation, or simply an extension of American principles. Either way, the message seeped through the wire. The war had not erased humanity entirely. Still, the prisoners wrestled with doubt. Was this kindness only temporary? Would it vanish once the world's attention turned elsewhere? At night, as floodlights swept the camp, men argued in hushed tones. Some insisted the Americans had revealed their true nature. Others believed it was all performance, a mask to hide future retribution. The debate became as much a part of camp life as the daily roll call. Eyewitness reports describe men lying awake, staring at the stars beyond the wire, wondering which America was real, The one that dropped bombs on Dresden, or the one that poured hot coffee into their cups? Both images lived side by side, impossible to reconcile. And so, behind the fences, a question hung heavy in the air. Had they glimpsed mercy, or only another face of power? The wire shone under the searchlights, silent, as if holding the answer just out of reach. The city was rubble, its skyline reduced to jagged stone and broken glass. American headquarters now occupied a surviving government building, its halls echoing with the sound of typewriters and boots on tile. Reports poured in daily from the prisoner of war camps scattered across occupied Germany. Food deliveries, Red Cross inspections, prisoner conditions. To some, these files read like a ledger of mercy. To others, they looked like a strategy disguised as kindness. Inside the camps, the gestures continued. Coffee poured in tin cups. Cigarettes traded for buttons and stories. Letters from home delivered with stamps still fresh. For prisoners, it was bewildering. For American commanders, it was policy. But the question remained, was this mercy born of principle or propaganda? Some officers believed the answer was clear. We must show the German soldiers the truth of democracy. One memorandum noted, treating captives with dignity was, in this view, part of the war's continuation by other means. Every parcel of food, every shared cigarette sent a message. America was not the monster the Reich had promised. It was discipline, not charity. A battlefield victory extended into the mind. Yet others argued it was simpler. They are men, not beasts, wrote a Red Cross worker in her log. For her, the duty was humanitarian, not strategic. The principles of the Geneva Convention demanded it. Compassion, she believed, should not depend on victory or politics. The difference mattered little to the prisoners themselves. For men who had been taught to expect cruelty, the treatment shook their convictions. Some began to doubt everything they had been told about the West. A captured officer admitted to an American guard, "If our people had done this, perhaps the war would have ended differently." Such confessions unsettled even the victors. But not all saw it as noble. German civilians outside the wire often went hungry, watching as their former soldiers received parcels of food and cigarettes. Mothers wrote bitter letters to Allied authorities. Why should prisoners eat when their children starve? According to recovered records, some locals accused the Allies of feeding the wolves before the lambs. The moral line blurred further. In Washington and London, the issue reached higher levels. Was it right to ease the burden of those who had fought for Hitler while survivors of Dachau and Buchenwald struggled to rebuild shattered lives? For some, the answer was no. For others, the principle of humane treatment was a way to distinguish democracy from fascism. To abandon it would be to adopt the very cruelty they had fought against. Prisoners sensed this tension. In camp diaries, some wrote of gratitude, others of confusion. "They treat us well," one entry noted, "but their cities lie in ruins because of us. How can they be so calm?" The paradox haunted them, making every sip of coffee feel heavy with unspoken meaning. The line between propaganda and principle blurred most in memory. Years later, many former prisoners recalled the mercy as a turning point, proof that their captors had not lost their humanity in victory. But in the moment, under barbed wire and searchlights, no one could be certain if the kindness was genuine or calculated. As one prisoner wrote in 1945, "The coffee is warm. The cigarettes are real. But I do not know if the hand that gives them does so from the heart or from the mind of war." The camp grew quiet after nightfall, the glow of cigarettes dotting the dark. Somewhere beyond the wire, a radio crackled with Allied broadcasts. And the question lingered in the smoke, mercy or message. The city still lay in ruins. Streets were lined with bricks and twisted steel, children scavenged for coal, and families lived in cellars where walls were damp with smoke and ash. Among the wreckage moved men who carried another kind of memory, those who had once been prisoners of war in American hands. They returned home thinner, quieter, and changed. In villages across Germany, the story spread. Former soldiers spoke not of cruelty behind the wire, but of coffee, parcels, and letters. "The Americans gave us food," one man told his neighbors, "when our own cupboards were bare." For civilians who had starved through the winter of 1945, such tales sounded like rumors, too generous to be real. But the memories persisted, carried in diaries, retold at kitchen tables, shaping how the war's end was remembered. The memories came with guilt. Many of these same men had fought in units that burned villages in Poland, executed partisans in Yugoslavia, or left Soviet captives to die in the snow. They knew what their own side had done to prisoners. To receive kindness where their armies had shown none weighed heavily. It was easier to fight than to live with mercy, one veteran later admitted in an interview. The contrast haunted them more than the battlefields. By 1947, Allied authorities noticed the effect. Some prisoners, once released, became advocates for reconciliation. They had seen a different face of the enemy, stern but fair, disciplined yet capable of compassion. For them, America was no longer an abstract foe, but a place of flesh and blood people who smoked, laughed, and brewed coffee even for captives. Historians later argued that these impressions helped plant early seeds for West Germany's alignment with the United States during the Cold War. But the narrative was not simple. In bombed-out neighborhoods, bitterness grew. Civilians who had lost children to Allied air raids could not accept tales of mercy from the same hands that dropped fire on Dresden and Hamburg. Kindness in camps, one widow said bitterly, did not bring back the dead. For many, gratitude and grief lived side by side, a contradiction as sharp as the barbed wire once surrounding the prisoners. Eyewitness accounts reveal the depth of these divided feelings. Some ex-prisoners remembered their first hot coffee with gratitude until their final days. Others confessed they poured it away, unable to accept comfort from those who had crushed their homeland. The memories cut both ways, leaving scars of confusion. Still, when asked decades later, many spoke of small acts with startling clarity. A cigarette shared at dusk. A guard who slipped an extra blanket to a fevered man. A Red Cross worker who pressed a letter into trembling hands. These details outlived the battles, etched into memory more deeply than tactics or victories. The war's ruins were slowly rebuilt into new streets and homes. Children grew up in cities where the rubble had been cleared, yet their fathers carried stories that did not fade. "The coffee was hot," one man told his son, "but the wire stayed cold." That sentence summed up the contradiction of their captivity. Moments of humanity within a world still shattered by cruelty. And so, in post-war Germany, gratitude and guilt became companions. The smell of American coffee lingered in memory, not as sweetness, but as a reminder that even in total war, mercy could seep through the cracks. But beneath the rebuilding, the question endured. Had they been forgiven or only spared?